Go.
Welcome to the penultimate session in this doctoral design series, Miami Urban Studies, Miami Do You Love Me? Before introducing the session today and welcoming our guest, I'd just like to make a brief announcement. That is to say, the doctoral design program is welcoming some further applications to start in August 2021. The application process can be found on our website. If you just Google FIU DDES, it should bring you there. The application date, the window is very tight. It's up until April the 15th. So if you're interested, please apply and be aware of the tightness and the timing. Okay, so I'd like to welcome you to our penultimate session in this series. A session that is called Ex Palude Aegre, City in a Swamp. I should perhaps explain that Latin joke. I was myself, of course, the translator of Alberti's Treatise on Architecture, De Re Ite Victoria, and I undertook that translation under Joseph Rickwert, who was in fact for a while one of the supervisors of one of our speakers today, Gray Reed. What it means is scarcely, barely out of the swamp, and I guess it was initially proposed in jest as a motto for FIU itself, whose main campus is approximately it's halfway between the Everglades themselves and Miami, and in many ways, this session today is halfway between our session last week on the Everglades with Evelyn Gaiser and next week's session on sea level rise itself, where we'll be dealing largely with Miami Beach. But there will be an overlap in many ways, because we're dealing with wetlands and we're also dealing with sea level rise in this particular session. So I'd like to say a few words of introduction about our guest today. First of all, my distinguished colleague, Gray Reed, who teaches history and theory, is a colleague of mine at FIU and holds a PhD from the University of Pennsylvania. Pursuing an interest in design strategies for sustainable cities, she has written 2 books on historical urbanism, focusing on human scale and theatrical qualities of public spaces. She has also written a summary of the history of climate to 1 billion years ago. She has recently been named a fellow of the FIU Wilsonian Public Humanities Lab. I should just briefly, I should mention that the name of her books, her main names for a book, Modern Architecture and Theatre, The Experiments of Art in Action, an edited volume, Architecture as a Performing Art with Marcia Feuerstein, and The Miniature and the Gigantic in Philadelphia, Architecture, Essays on Designing the City to Human Scale. I'm also delighted today to welcome my colleague Roberto Rovira. He is the chair of landscape architecture in FIU Carter. He's a landscape architect with a design and engineering and fine arts background and an associate professor. At the Miami Beach Urban Studios, Roberto is able to work with clients on projects as well as conducting research in a space where art, design, and technology come together. I was checking up his various CVs, and he's been awarded given a number of awards for his landscape architecture practice. And I noticed that recorded here that he has an MLA from Rhode Island School of Design and a BSc in mechanical engineering, no less, from Cornell University. I can only assume that he is a climate refugee from Ithaca, having taught there myself and knowing what it's like in the middle of winter there. Roberto was also, this is a surprise to me, also served as a US naval officer from 1990 to 1994. So it's great to have Roberto here. And then I'd like to welcome Phil Stoddard, who has been a professor of biology at FIU since 1992 and mayor of South Miami between 2010 and 2020. In 2015, Mayor Stoddard was appointed by the White House to the Governance Coordinating Committee of the National Ocean Council, where he developed national policy for sea level rise. Mayor Stoddard was named by Politico magazine to the Politico 50 Guide to the Thinkers, Doers, and Visionaries Transforming American Politics in 2016. Miami New Times named Mayor Stoddard the best politician in 2017. And Phil is a big proponent of renewable energy, with his house and car being powered by the sun. I didn't know that either. And I just want to stress that actually at FIU School of Architecture, we have very strong connections with the Department of Biology. And finally, I'd like to welcome a relatively youngster, Maria Flores, who was one of my students not so long ago, has recently graduated from FIU School of Architecture. And I'd like to congratulate Maria on being selected to present her work in the Digital Futures young presentation next week on Saturday. So this will be the penultimate session. We will be we'll be live streaming for an hour and a half, so it'll be a little shorter than usual. But I'd like to welcome our distinguished guest today and hand over to Gray Reed. Do you want to say, sorry, Gray, do you want to,
yeah, I think Roberto will go first. We have an order of presentation here. So Roberto, and then Phil, and then me, and finally we'll wind up with Maria's project.
Thank you, Roberto.
All right, so I'm going to share my screen. Give me one moment.
Oh, let me stop sharing. Sorry. Okay. Go ahead.
All right. Okay, let's see. Get rid of that. Can you see my cover page with Miami?
Yep, we're good.
Can you see that?
Yep.
Great. All right. Well, thank you, Neil, and my colleagues here. It's wonderful to be a part of this. I put together, a number of slides that speak to the idea of Miami barely out of swamp by just thinking of it in terms of its relationship to a surface, above, below, and on, and what that means for our identity. But in a larger context, I think that I wanted to start with just situating this idea that oftentimes we find cities built in very unlikely places. I mean, they should not have been built where they are. In the Bay, for example, you have this landscape that's riddled with faults, and nevertheless, you have one of the most incredible economies and technologies in the Bay Area. That's something that if you were to plan it out in a rational way, you probably would not want to place, so many people in such an important part of an economy in a place as vulnerable as that. But that trend seems to go back quite a ways. Mexico City, Tenochtitlan was built on a lake bed, in fact, and from that lake bed, in the throes of history and revolution, today there's over 33 million people that live there. In our case, in South Florida, if you were to map out, as this diagram does, all the storms with winds over 75 miles an hour, this is what you would get. And this is where we are. This is where we've chosen to live. So this unlikely location for this thriving metropolis is one that this is kind of a pattern that we share with many other places in the world. And I am going to focus a little bit on the area that I know best, and this kind of jarring juxtaposition between what you see on the left, which is this, see the grain of the river grass carving this very subtle geometry of landforms, juxtaposed with the grain of agriculture and development on the right, where I happen to live. I live about 8 miles from this boundary in the Redland in Florida. And I've spent some time experimenting in my own backyard, just playing with above the surface, leaving areas of the back unmowed and just doing nothing at all to these patches to see what happens. And it's incredible what you can find and what you can observe. Not only is it, this place for my dog to frolic, but in an early morning, you walk out there and you see this amazing city that is a series of cobwebs that have been built overnight that last through noon sun, and at these just remarkable geometries, this mathematical precision sitting on top of this unattended area of the landscape. These are pictures of my wife. These are not stock photographs. And it's just amazing what happens just a foot above the surface or two. And this is true for, I think, South Florida. It's a landscape that does not have, this rich topography. In that subtle cross-section of a few feet, you can accomplish and see many, many things. And as a landscape architect, I try to play around in that band. And these are some of the experiments and some of the things that I'm able to do, observe and see and use as part of the work that I do. So these become a setting for observation, but also a plinth for artwork and sculpture and experiments that of late, this one piece that I did over the holidays with my kids, we built this, I call it the space-time rookery. And just putting it out there brings in the life of, migrating birds. Phil was nice enough to help me identify this is an American kestrel. So just doing this, positioning the structure in this landscape in the middle of this flow of migratory birds, suddenly allows you to see things that you would not see, which is something that's a part of landscape architecture in my mind. So above the surface, these things happen, but below the surface is just as incredible. And one of the the primary civil engineers and engineers, Alligator, is the author of this, what I call ecology through topography. And just in creating a series of alligator holes for its habitat, alligator begins scratching with its, claw, snout, starts to create these depressions, which over time bring in the wet season, you have fish coming in and birds that feed on those fish. In the dry season, these become vital moments for life to thrive, and little by little, these become seeded and they grow into these independent habitats. And it's really interesting to see. This is the work of one of my students who mapped out the relationship between the distance from canals and the number of alligator holes. The blue here is the structure that was built artificially to drain the Everglades, and the proximity of the alligator holes, which these now have become highways for these alligators. Obviously that relationship, this kind of intentional manipulation of the landscape, obviously has the effect of changing that ecology and tapping into, I guess, the pattern of alligators' role in shaping that. And so this is something, that's alligator holes, but we're not far from landscape architects. This is a, project that I've been working on for some time. We dig below ground. We find these magnificent cross sections of lime rock, dig wells just a few feet below the surface. It's like striking oil, and we're able to create spaces like this. This is a project that I've been working on for a couple of years, which basically harvested the limestone and created this stacked waterfall. It creates its own habitat and its own alligator hole, if you will. So I'm always drawn by this kind of irrepressible quality of Miami, both for, again, this kind of limited, you say, cross-section, but nevertheless one that's just absolutely chock full of forces that are in a constant state of wanting to claim its space and its identity. This is a great ficus very close to Vizcaya, and this is the substrate, the rocks that are all in the context of a place that has this very powerful identity. That's as much of place as it is about imagination and connection to other places. So to me, that's something that's a pattern that as human beings, we're fascinated by the natural world, both for its beauty, for its kind of sublime qualities, this allure that can pull you in, but it can also kill you. And I find that in that space, and in my work, I try to find ways in which the art and the science and the technology can come together. And no one did that better, in my mind, than Alexander von Humboldt. These are probably images that you have all seen. In this case, von Humboldt, in a pre-Darwin time, went about mapping these ecotones in relation to the sea level. And he went and he did these maps of the Himalayas and the Andes. He documented all kinds of characteristics of not only vegetation, flora, and fauna variations, but things like how blue is the sky depending on where you were in relation to the sea, when did water boil, etc. And what's fascinating about this, and one of the reasons why I'm so drawn to these, is that they achieve this balance between what is a scientific illustration, artistic illustration, with a very rigorous process of documentation and research. And I feel that by trying to do that, one is able to get much farther in bringing about arguments or convincing folks about whether to opt for a design that works with the natural world or against it. The relationship between art and science goes back. I look at the great of artists' impressions of the natural world as exploration was happening, as ships were crossing the oceans, unable to bring back the live specimens oftentimes, but able to bring back these beautiful renditions of these exotic and strange fruit that they found in the Americas. And again, these illustrations, as I guess full and innocuous as they seem if you look at them strictly as art, became vehicles to defy financiers and exploration and people to dare their lives and their treasure to find places such as the one we live in now in Miami. And so it's true that there's an incredible complexity of information, and every year dozens, hundreds of books, websites come up that try to catalog the natural world in many ways. I find that these tools are essential to try and contend with the level and the hunger for development that we see on the world as our population grows, as we expand into new. These are all the roads in the world, and like in our program in landscape architecture, where we have on this tropical and subtropical band, for good reason, because currently 3 billion people live in this band now. And the projection is that 6 billion will live here by 2100. And this happens to be one of the most threatened parts of the world. So I see that it's our role to find ways to figure out how to best contend with growth and development here, and find tools that allow us to do that in a sensitive and thoughtful way. So for quite some time now, I've been developing this project that I call the Ecological Atlas, which tries to take complexity of the natural world, which to many people might seem off-putting. If you show a cross-section of this a coastal upland in Florida, it's for folks to try and no pun intended, the forest trees. But if we were to find a way to take this and look at it on one level as information and data, you could take that specimen and series of specimens in that community, and you could catalog them like done here. And this catalog goes from January to December. And according to the species, you look at any moment here, and you can understand that in June, from June until October, September, for example, Fakahatchee grass is going to be in bloom. Bougainvillea has ups and downs in terms of its bloom. And you can see that complexity simplified in an intuitive way. Now, go one step further, you could use all this information once cataloged and work backward. And let's suppose, like now, we're just finishing March, April. If you look outside, I'm sure you've seen these bright yellow trees in bloom. And you might not know what they are, but because you're in Miami and this is March, you can backward and catalog that specimen and try and drill down and find all kinds of information through a tool platform like the Ecological Atlas. It tells you it's originally from Brazil. It has limited olfactory qualities. It is moderately salt tolerant, and it thrives in good sun. This is all data that could be then be incorporated into systems to allow you to draw and pull that out. And that's for one tree, but we could do this for entire ecosystems, like we have done for hundreds of native flowers, birds, butterflies, fish, etc. This data here is organized vertically, so the calendar goes from January to December in a vertical sense, December at the top. And this is an alphabetical listing of native Florida, which you can then, just data that could be sorted, could be organized following manner. Here, it's just organized by bloom times. So early on in the year, our early bloomers are here, and then later in the year, have all the species that bloom a bit later. Incredibly useful as a designer, because then you can say, I would like to have a landscape of native flora that blooms purple for my birthday, yellow for my anniversary, or not, or there's many other reasons to do that, but that's just one example. Is once you have that information, you can then work backward and inform your design in a very thoughtful way. All of that is based on an incredible amount of legwork and underlying data. And that is one of the spreadsheets of native flora, but we've also done this for vegetables and fruit. You can understand what's in season, butterflies, birds, and in the bird image, you can understand when there's two birds, it's spring season. When they're absent, they're not migrating through Florida. And again, it takes this massive amount of information that is overwhelming for most people to understand, and just creates this very intuitive method that doubles as both a scientific and design tool, but also as an aesthetic and art tool, because have had the chance to show this at our Wynwood and our Basel and Coriolis Museum here, and people refer to it as art. But it's an epiphany when they realize that it's actually based on what I consider to be the DNA thumbprint of where we live. To take it one step further, and about to wrap up here, this takes a plant community of the South Florida coastal upland, and it arranges a relationship to the water. So the species that are close to the water here are cataloged in a calendar for seasonality vertically, and then for the coastal upland here. So in one image, you get a sense of scale of species, and you get a sense of relationships between plants and animals, and relationships between where they are in connection to the water. Our research has gone beyond just visual catalog and starts to look at how salt tolerance and storm surge and sea level rise would impact that palette for Miami. So those 84 plants where we began are narrowed down to 31 that are salt tolerant. If we wanted to see the impact of what plants would survive if you were flooded with, or in a constant salty environment. So visually, we can go from 84 to 31 and show that very intuitively. We can also map out how each of these species, for butterflies in particular, there's nectar plants and host plants. Host plants are when they're laying eggs or caterpillars. Each one of these plants has a relationship to a number of species of butterflies. And as nectar plants, as adults, butterflies need these nectars to feed. So we have mapped out those relationships, and you can see the massive tangle of relationships of 84 plants for South Florida and ecosystems of butterflies that it sustains. If you take out the plants that are only salt tolerant, you immediately see the impact of that. So this might help us prioritize what to protect and what we want to thrive if we want an ecosystem that is biodiverse. And that's it. So it's great to be a part of this group, and I look forward to the discussion. I'll pass it on to, I think, Phil.
Wow, thank you, Roberto. That's amazing. Just the idea that you can see the relationships between plants and animals sort of visually with all of the data is just amazing.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks, Roberto. We'll have questions at the end, but that was great. Thank you.
Okay, I'll come on here. Let me share my screen. Here we go. How's it look?
We're not in presentation mode yet, but
Yeah, you want to click on the screen at the bottom there to make it full screen. Just to the very bottom line. That's it. Yeah.
All right.
there you go.
Okay. So what does that look right from your end?
Yep.
Great.
Good. Perfect. Thank you. Okay. So I got an email in late 2006 that I thought was a joke, but it turned out not to be. Politico magazine had named me and my friend, Professor Harold Wanless, to their Politico 50 as their collection of doers and thinkers driving politics in the United States, or driving political thinking. And we had come to notoriety for explaining sea level rise and climate change to the public. When I was first elected mayor in 2010, nobody between me and the sky was talking about this. Certainly our Congress wasn't, our state representatives weren't, President Obama was working on healthcare. There was nobody. And so I began learning this science and explaining it to the public, which is sort of, what I felt I had to do. And Harold Wanless was my partner in crime. And so it caught the attention of Politico magazine, and this was the picture they ran of us, which was sort of fun. And in Miami, the water is never far away. It's below our feet. And this really applies to probably every coastal city on the planet, not just Miami, but everywhere. Washington, D.C., much of it is low. London, Shanghai, Sydney, Australia, Buenos Aires, many of the coastal cities of the planet people live very close to the water. If they're not close to the water's edge, they're close to the water surface below their feet. These two pictures are taken in our backyard. The one on the left is what we call the grotto, is a hole we dug and vegetated, and that's Gray standing above it. And then to the right is the pond in our backyard, and this is elevated water, about 2 meters above the water table. We brought the water up so we can have a pond in the backyard. And we restored what used to be there. This area was indeed part of the natural landscape that had water in it. And so we put it back. But what I want to talk to you about here is the past and the future. And here I'm stealing from my wife, Gray Reed. And these are some images from her most recent book project. And she's done some interesting things. She's gone back in time looking at the climate of the Earth's history. And she's looked at the CO2 concentration. She's looked at the temperature, and she's looked at the human population, and she's looked at the sea level. And all four of those things are plotted on every graph. And she goes back 1 year, 10 years, 100 years, 1,000, et cetera, by powers of 10 back as far as we can trace it. She goes back 1 billion years. And then she steps forward in time in a very speculative exercise, looking at what could happen, what might happen, and what we might do about it. But I showed this picture. I'm going to give you 3 pictures here. And this is the 1,000-year history. And I show this picture because the population change, the red line, is very dramatic. We go from a pretty flat population, and then we hit the Industrial Revolution about 1700, and the human population explodes. The planet's seen nothing like it. And you can see sea level here is just starting to take off a little bit. Temperature is just starting to increase a little bit. But this black line here, carbon dioxide, dead flat with just a little bobble there, which is probably caused by the little ice age and possibly the Black Plague as well. But then the CO2 takes off and it rockets upwards and it's not stopping. So this is about where we were last year at 415 parts per million, which is, we haven't seen in the past 1,000 years. Let's go back 10,000 years. And I choose this because this is the duration of recorded history of mankind. This is as long as people have been keeping track of things. We've existed as a species about 1 million years, but only for the last 10,000 years have we created a recorded history. It's about as long as we've been building out of stone as well. And one of the interesting things, here is, look at this blue line. This is sea level. So sea level was rising as the glaciers melted, and then it pretty much flattened out. And so this is from about 7,000 BC to the present is really the duration we have recorded history. So as far as humans have been recording history, the sea levels have been flat. They haven't changed much. There have been little upsets here and there. There was an earthquake and the Alexandria Library in Egypt fell into the Red Sea. But other than little upsets, mostly the water's been flat. So from all of man's thinking and women's thinking, the oceans stay put. The land stays the same. You know, we pass down land from generation to generation. We live on land across the generations. And people, even in my own city of South Miami, talk about future generations being here. And this all gets challenged by the science. And I'll take you through a fairly simplistic explanation. But if we go back and look at 100 million years of the Earth's history, this is a very complicated picture, but I'm going to walk you through it. So let's look at carbon dioxide. That's this black line here. And you can see it's bounced around a little bit. But this is where we are now, this red horizontal line. 415 parts per million of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And so we're right there, right on the right-hand edge. And so first exploration is, how far back in time do we have to go to find a time when we had this much carbon dioxide in the atmosphere? How far back? And there's a little bit of uncertainty in the data, but scientists think that approximately 22 million years ago, we had about 415 parts per million carbon dioxide. And it's moved around a little bit, but that's about where it was. So let's drop that line down to the sea level rise or sea level graph. And when we last had about 415 parts per million CO2, the ocean's level was right down here, bouncing around a little bit, but it was pretty stable for a long time. And how high is that? Well, this one actually means 100 meters. So it's about halfway between 0 and 100 meters. 0 being reference to the present, or maybe 100 years ago. And this being 100 meters, so about 50 meters. So the sea level was bouncing around for a long time in the range of about 50 meters higher than it is today. And that's when the CO2 levels were higher. And that is why scientists are extremely worried about sea level rise and carbon dioxide, and why we're so concerned about getting the carbon dioxide levels down. Now, the problem is we don't have an easy way to lower the carbon dioxide levels. It's easy to raise them. It's hard to lower them. And so most scientists I know think that we have baked in to our plan the melting of the polar ice caps. And when the polar ice caps melt, they melt quickly. And quick to a geologist, I say, how fast is that? They say, oh, 100 or 200 years. I say, which one? 100 or 200? It makes a big difference to me. They said, oh, you can't tell from the geological record. But 200 years and 100 years are both fast in geological time. So that's worrisome. And we don't know exactly how the ice is going to melt. We've never watched it before. That was before recorded history. But what we see now is destabilizing of the glaciers in Greenland. We see water getting under the grounding line of the glaciers down in Antarctica. The Thwaites Glacier, Pine Island Glacier look like they could destabilize and move a lot of ice into the water. So this is hard to get your head around. I mean, humans have never seen this. We've never planned for it. We're not very good at planning for things like this that we've never seen. But this is what our Earth's history has done in the past. And there's no reason to think this is not what it's going to do in the future. So let's blow that picture up and look really close. So here's just a closer picture of what I was showing you before, just looking at the sea level. So you see how sea level has been, had a long stable period at sort of, 40 to 60 meters above where it is today. That is a stable state for the Earth. It's a lot of water, folks. So I explained a lot of this to Jeff Goodell, who was a writer for Rolling Stone magazine, and this was the story he produced from it. And I also explained to him the economics, and he doubled the length of the story to incorporate that. And when this story came out, it shook up Miami, particularly the realtors who were trying to sell real estate. And they said that Professors Mayor Stoddard and Professor Wanlos had to be stopped, but you can stop us, but you can't stop the climate. But that is 50 meters on the Miami skyline. Imagine trying to live in a city like that. But it's not going to happen overnight, obviously. So what are we looking at in terms of the scenarios that Miami will face? And so this imagery comes from a friend of mine, Peter Harlem, who was at FIU and who very unfortunately died a couple of years ago, but he was a sweet guy. But Peter was very interested in elevation imagery. So he made a bunch of photographs of aerial images of Fort Lauderdale and Miami, and then he superimposes on those sea level rise. So here's how it looks today. The green is in the lower picture is Biscayne Bay, and in the upper picture, the blue to the right is the Atlantic Ocean. It's greener down here in Miami. So that is 1 foot or 1/3 of a meter of sea level rise. And you will see this. This will happen in the next 20 years. So you start to see Fort Lauderdale gets a lot of blue. That's surface water. Miami, it's mostly spillover from the existing waterways. Here's 2 feet of sea level rise, 2/3 of a meter. There's compromise on Miami Beach. Fort Lauderdale is beginning to get pretty wet. I'm going to back up just so you can see. Dunk, dunk. Here's just about 1 meter of sea level rise. And Fort Lauderdale is really getting it. Miami is starting to get urban water. There's 2 meters. Fort Lauderdale is mostly gone. And Miami is carved up into a series of islands. Miami Beach is gone. Key Biscayne, Virginia Key are mostly gone. Miami's airport has just little bits above the water. The western suburbs are gone. And the eastern part of Miami is a series of islands. There it is at 3 meters. Fort Lauderdale is completely gone, and Miami is a series of very small islands. That green to the right, of course, was water to begin with, and it's still going to be water. But the land is gone. Now, one of the things that people often talk about when they're talking about sea level rise is how high is it going to be in 30 years? So there's a range of guesses at this point. How high will it be in 50 years? There's a range of guesses. But that's the wrong way to look at it, because the sea level rise is an accelerating function, and it's not going to stop until it gets to 50 meters. So even if you build for a 30-year scenario, in 40 years, the water's higher, and it's overtopped what you built for in 30 years. If you build for a 40-year scenario, assuming we know what that is, it's overtops that in 45 years. It's accelerating. Anything you build for, it's going to get higher than that in just a few years beyond that. And that's the problem of an accelerating function. So we're not thinking about the problem right. People thinking about how high do I need to design for? That's the wrong question. The question is, how long do you want your building to last? And what will the neighborhood look like when the water rises and when buildings begin to fail? So even if you design the most beautiful water-resistant building in the world, does somebody want to live there if it's surrounded by crumbling buildings that were not designed the same way? So architecture doesn't exist in a beautiful magazine as an isolated building. Architecture exists in an urban fabric, and the fate of that urban fabric really determines the accessibility and the livability of the most water-resistant building among them. It's almost as though the least protected areas define whether you want to live someplace, not the best protected ones. So I'm going to give you some questions here to think about, and then we're going to come back. And at the end, we're going to turn off YouTube so nobody's going to hear what you say. And we're going to talk about these questions and your thoughts on them. So maybe you want to take a screenshot of these and think about them. Maybe just write them down. But I've got the list of everybody in this class, and I can ask you directly. So let's just think about these questions here. And the first one is, how do you think about designing for meters of sea level rise? And as I said, not a particular height, but just the fact that it's going up by meters. You know, an English expression would be, how do you get your head around this problem? So let's, you know, I have a lot of respect for architects and engineers too, their ingenuity. Architects can really design for anything, and engineers can build anything, but it costs a lot of money. And so what would it cost per square foot or per square meter to make one building resist meters of sea level rise? Could an owner afford to insure that building? And at those prices, who will be living there? A rich person could live there, but what about waiters or people who serve coffee, store clerks, school teachers, mechanics, plumbers, or nurses? You know, do rich people want to live someplace with nobody to provide a service economy for them? So if you were to have a floating city or an elevated city, it has to be something that everybody can afford, not just wealthy people. That question almost answers itself. But the other thing to think about is that every crisis affords some kind of opportunity. And so if we do not choose to try to elevate cities, then people have to move. And if people move, how do we move? And how do designers and urban planners create new cities and expand old cities? And can you make them as good as they are now? Can you make them better than they are now? And can they be healthier than our existing cities? Can they be greener? Can they be more fair? Can they give everybody the opportunity to live a good life and a healthy life, and to raise their children in a place without pollution, without dirty water floating around their houses? Because I can tell you, flooded cities are not safe places to live. I was talking to a reporter who covered New Orleans after the Hurricane Katrina floods. And he was interviewing somebody outside of their stadium where a lot of people were taking refuge. And he said a dog swam past in the water and it was thirsty, and it took a couple of sips from the water and it died right there in front of them. I mean, so flooded places are toxic and nobody should live there. And likewise, we should not leave behind toxins that are going to get into the environment and create a whole toxic water system. I mean, that's one of my biggest concerns actually, is what happens to these places as the water level starts approaching the surface and as they begin to flood intermittently. Do we create a toxic mess that ruins everything for us and every other creature in the region? Or do we somehow restore it to a state where many organisms can live there? So that's it for now, and we'll talk later.
Okay, thanks. I think I'm up next.
Yes.
Okay, does that work?
Yes.
Okay. Okay. Well, that is sobering, and to think about that it's not so much a question of building as a question of moving. And so I want to talk about barely out of the swamp. This idea that Miami was built up out of the swamp in the first place, and the water's going to come up around us and that we'll go back into the swamp. But what I want to focus on specifically is issues of social justice and sustainability. So I'll offer two images. This is the first. This is the founding crime of Miami, actually a double crime. A crime against nature in that the Miami was cleared of the mangroves. This is a picture of workers in 1910 clearing mangroves off of Miami Beach. It wasn't the beach side, but the bay side. And we know that mangroves are a nursery for fish and for all of the life of the bay. And that Miami has been built effectively with a hardened shoreline. So all of that life and all of that potential for life has been erased. And the land has been built up as a kind of platform above the water. And there, you have heard about some of the other crimes against nature, the draining of the Everglades. And so Miami is really founded on this denial of the life, of the inherent life of the place. And I got to tell you that right at this moment, I'm looking out the window and I see a painted bunting. It's a beautiful bird that's, that migrates here in the winter. So the second crime in this photograph are the Black workers who are doing the labor. And they came from the Bahamas and from North Florida to work for effectively slave wages. And you can see in the picture the overseer who is directing the work. And this 1910 was a moment when there was a lot of pushback against the civil rights movement. So these workers are really, really being exploited at this point. And that inequality, that racial division exists throughout the southern United States. And Miami is certainly a southern city in that in that sense. This is Jermaine Barnes, who teaches at, an image created by Jermaine Barnes, who teaches at the University of Miami. And he notes that segregation was enforced by law until 1956, such that the workers, the Black workers in the Miami Beach hotels, could not go to the beach. They also could not spend the night on Miami Beach. They needed to go back over, across the causeway to an area that was designated. It was called the Central Negro District. And it was that they were confined to that area like a ghetto. So the second crime is a crime against humanity at the very foundation of Miami Beach. And that is perpetuated into an extreme difference between rich and poor in the city. And we have some of the wealthiest people in the world living in Miami Beach and elsewhere. There's just awash in money. At the same time, a recent report said that 60% of Miamians struggle to meet their basic needs: housing, food, healthcare. There's something wrong with this picture. So this is the second image. This comes from the current exhibit that's up at the Museum of Modern Art called Architecture and Blackness in America. And it's a vision by Olalekan Joyfus about what would Brooklyn look like if it were a just city. And a just city, meaning that if the city really were for the people, by the people, and took care of the people, and that they had a real sense of agency in their own living environment. And what strikes me is that these images of a city of justice are really the same as images of a sustainable city. And, you know, when you think about it, that makes sense. Because what is justice? Justice is a system based on truth and on respect for the rights of others. And the rights of others has been an expanding category in the United States. That when the country was founded, the voting rights were extended only to white male landowners. And after the Civil War in the 1850s, when slavery was abolished, voting rights were extended to Black men. So men had voting rights. By 1920, white women were granted voting rights, and it wasn't until later in the 20th century that Black women were finally given the right to vote. Now, these rights have also been extended. Children have certain rights. Animals have rights that are increasingly being recognized. And now rivers are granted a state of personhood or a state of legally defensible rights in countries like New Zealand and India. The river Ganges has specific defensible rights, legal rights under the law. And Ecuador has recognized the rights of nature. Sort of in the words of an environmental organization that we contribute to, the earth needs a good lawyer. So I think when I look back over the work that I've done in Miami, it's been a kind of quest for glimpses of that just city, sort of within a city that we know that's defined by injustice. And you look for these images, perhaps in people's desires, perhaps in their memories, or maybe in their imagination. So I'll talk about a couple of projects that I've done. One was a historical project about how the civil rights movement used public space in Miami. This is a picture of a standoff at a public beach that the Black community said, look, you know, we want to go to the beach. And the white community said, no, you know, this is whites only. And they just kept coming until Miami finally established a Black only beach. This was under the current law in the 40s up until 1956 that public facilities should be separate but equal. Whatever the whites had for white only property, the Black should have something equal in scope. And of course, that was never true. The facilities for Blacks were never equal to the facilities for whites, and that was recognized finally in 1956 and was overthrown, as were the segregation laws. But it took that kind of pressure to bring that kind of change in the United States, and the South was particularly reluctant. The second, here's the Virginia Key Beach in the 1950s. The second demonstration was at Miami's only public golf course. And in this instance, this was also in the early 50s, that 6 Black golfers turned up to play on the public course, and they said, no, you can't come. Next day, 15 showed up. The next day, 50 showed up. And the case was pushed all the way to the Supreme Court. And by this time, so they lost the case, but civil rights legislation was making advances to the point where Black players were finally admitted to the course. And there is a golf tournament called the North-South Tournament that celebrates that. So this was one project about public space, that perhaps the just city is in our desires, in the desires of the Black community to simply enjoy the landscape. And that sense that the demonstrations in Miami were specifically in the landscapes of pleasure, those things that were not part of the workaday world, but were part of the world of enjoyment. And so that sort of mark of how Miami defined civil equality and that sense of desire to enjoy the landscape. Okay, maybe the just city we can glimpse in our memories. And sometimes I ask my students to draw a memory map, what they remember from their childhood growing up, places and people that were important to them growing up. And these are not literal maps, these are maps as we remember things. And the memories of childhood are often very sweet. We remember, our house, the places that we played, our grandparents' house, the things that we enjoyed. And these maps give us a glimpse, not of a sort of reality, but of a sort of nostalgia, or of how we wish things were, or how we remember them. So we took a bunch of students to work with a local nonprofit who represented agricultural workers who had mostly migrated from Central America and Mexico. And we were working with the Humanities Action Lab, a group out of Rutgers University. And our students talked with some of the agricultural workers, here they are working, and asked them about their childhood, to describe the towns that they grew up. And here's a map that one of the participants drew of her hometown in Guatemala. And you can see there's her house, her grandparents' house, the ball field, the church. These were the sort of elements of the heart that she remembers from her hometown. Our students also did drawings based on their descriptions. And this is a map of showing Anna's town, sort of nestled in the mountains in Guatemala, the workshop behind her mother's house, and her working in the fields, the town, and the room that she shared with her sister. So these are very, very sort of human memories of a sweet life of childhood. Here's another drawing by a student of Francisca's town in Honduras, also nestled in the mountains, accessible really only by paths over the hills. And here's another Anna, a different Anna, who one of the participants who drew her own map. And we see many of the same elements. We see the downtown, the little shop downtown. We see some of the gardens. We see the ball fields and the church. Sort of elements. This is a drawing by one of our students based on Anna's description of the mountains behind her home in Guatemala. and another drawing by a student based on Moses's recollections of the landscape, the church, working on cars, playing music, the things that he enjoyed growing up. And finally, Rosa's Ranch, drawn by Antonio Comas, just a beautiful picture of the fields and the home that she remembers. So perhaps this city of justice is in our memories, or in what we think of, what we recollect often nostalgically about those memories. Now that I'm drawing, I can remember everything. And maybe the just city and the sustainable city can be glimpsed in the imagination. And this is a project that I did, imagining how Miami might be different. Imagining if we took the roofs of Miami and we planted them with gardens and recreation spaces. And we took that space that is virtually unused and made it a landscape really of pleasure up above the city. And you sort of think, all right, what would Miami look like if the roofscape were a sort of second landscape that was lifted up above the existing landscape and effectively replaced? How would Miami be different? The parking garages are structured so that they could carry whole forests that could become sanctuaries for birds who fly in at night. The accessible rooftops can become recreation fields or gardens producing some of the food that we eat. We can imagine a city differently. And I think that power to imagine is crucial when we are addressing, as Phil says, buried within each crisis is an opportunity. You can imagine things differently. And you sort of look at the total area that the roof encompasses. It's quite a lot. That the city begins to look very differently when you think of it as a landscape. And I know Roberto has shared in this sort of dream as well. So finally, the most recent project that I'm beginning to be involved with is a grant project to work with low-income neighborhoods, 6 low-income neighborhoods in Miami, with a team of scientists and social scientists. So we'll work with community groups to assess their risk from sea level rise, risk from gentrification, from increasing storm strengths and so forth, and develop strategies for resilience that may well include strategies for moving out of harm's way. So that's what I'm up to. I'm gonna end it there and pass it off to Maria Flores, who has Maria, are you there?
Yeah, thank you, Greg.
Okay. A beautiful vision of what downtown Miami might look like after the flood.
Thank you guys so much for your presentation. It is so joyful to hear what everyone else is doing. So I would like to share, as Greg said, this presentation that I did for, can everyone see it, by the way?
Cannot see it yet.
Yeah.
I see a white rectangle. Here we go. There we go.
Okay, perfect. So this is a presentation that I did for my master thesis. It was about a 6-month research into what was going to happen to Miami in the future, right? So I did some research, some analysis, and Philip's presentation was really good about the idea of sea level rise and those meters and feet that the water is going to rise in Miami. And not many people, I mean, nobody really knows what's going to really happen. So this is mostly a predicament and a storytelling exercise that I did. And then 1 year later, I did with Gray Reed the MAA at FIU. Okay, so let's start off. I'm going to be showing some diagrams that I did at first to better explain the project, right? So I went to Brickell and I started realizing what would happen if the water rose to 3 meters, 9 meters, or maybe 12 in the future, right? So that was my pending question in my head. I took a particular area in Brickell that I found really interesting, and this is basically what I thought would happen, right? People would drown, some people would lose their homes, and that would mean that the rich, right, as Philip also mentioned, the rich are going to be able to take advantage of the situation. I mean, it's better real estate if you think about it, because who wouldn't want to live in islands? And not many people would have the possibility of buying these places and apartments. So my idea was to do a storytelling exercise that basically saw Miami entering into a new society and a way of living, rather than giving this to the rich and saying, let's wait for the government to solve an issue. Let's actually have the people in Miami come together as a community, therefore called the colony, that would solve the issue together as a community. So these diagrams right here, they're just showing the streets. What would happen to the bottom of the buildings if, let's say, we have 50 feet of sea level rise coming in? What would happen to the structure of the building? Are we going to keep the columns? Are we going to keep the shear walls? So my idea, as you can see in the diagram in the middle, is to get rid of everything that will be underwater. Everything is going to be scavenged by the scavengers. So we have this now community in Miami that is going to be useful for scavenging items that are underwater. We will go into missions underwater with boats, just salvaging everything that we can in terms of materials, wood, pieces of the building that have come apart. And then we're going to be using that to create a structure with shear walls, columns, and start a life that is completely above street level, right? So in the diagram at the left, you can see this grid-like system that is being put in place by scavengers and this new community in Miami in the future that will be holding the mass, or basically streets that are now going to be rising above the sea level. So my whole idea was then to carve out the buildings, keep the structure, keep shear walls, keep concrete, and carve out everything that you're not using. Instead of giving it to the rich, now you give it to the community, and you start creating public spaces inside of the building. And at this point, if you can see the image on that I have in the middle, we would be introducing streetways or walkways and everything that can incorporate the buildings in a 50-foot span, 100. That's why we would need all the scavengers to do. So all this would be materials that they found underwater that they're now putting together to create this new life, basically above the street level. And then at the end, we would require to do some sort of circulation system that is attached to the buildings. So the circulation now, instead of being horizontal, like the circulation that we have in Miami, now it would be just all vertical. From the sea level, like around 50 feet above the street level, all the way to perhaps 100 feet, 150, depending on the building height. So now what I'm going to do is that I'm going to share the book that I did for the colony and basically the, hold on, now I'm going to be sharing another screen. Okay, So this is a book that I did for the colony, and this includes a lot of, let's say, models. Can you guys see the screen? It's giving me some sort of error.
No, we can see it.
Got it.
Okay. You see like the colony and the model?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So I started doing, after the diagrams and researching all these things, I started creating a series of models that would basically show me how can things be put together. If I want the scavengers and all this new community of people in the colony to put together a system of materials that they found underwater, how is that going to be happening, right? How are the citizens going to be living in this new world? So the idea in this model, it's precisely that. We have the water coming in, and this is next to the Paris Art Museum and the American Airlines Arena. We create and attach some sort of platforms with columns, and we attach it to buildings so that people can now take over and create public space that is not on street level. Now the public space is going to be inside of the buildings and also on top of the street level, right? So in this next one, you can see how these new materials can be put together. Then this is a picture of people that are going to be walking around through the buildings, the circulation and scaffolding systems that can happen attached to the buildings. These are the columns that remain from the buildings that were there before, and now we're just carving out apartments, and we're just creating public space for people to live and park, and to, instead of working so much, now these people can actually give something back to the environment and be together and communicate in a better way than what we're doing now. So this is one of the images that I overlaid with Photoshop on the back, and you can see this walkways, scaffold system, circulation that is basically going to be happening in this new world. And you have flying drones as well. You can't forget the flying drones. And here in the back, you can see the water. And this would be almost like a park-like structure that people can now start to have screens, and they can view movies, text, anything that is happening around the world. They can see it on the buildings and stuff like that. So after this, after doing the models, along with Gray, we started saying, okay, well, how can we approach this and actually show it to the public? So that's where the storytelling part came about. After doing the models, we realized that there was something missing, and that was a story, right? So the story needed a character that many people could agree with, that they could feel that they're a part of the community. And we chose to have a character who's a child, and I'll show you guys in a minute. This character is a child, and his name is Ishmael. So the idea is to show and represent the colony and how things are going to be happening, the technology aspect of the colony, how people are going to be living through a comic-like structure. And it all comes down to one person who's Ishmael. He's 8 years old, and he basically just travels around the colony showing everyone what the colony is all about. And so we have stories, we have comic strips, and finally we have collages with drawings on top. So this is one of the drawings, which I'm not sure why you can't see it too well. It's a little bit blurry. This is one of the drawings. This would be the bathing stations in the colony. You have baths that now occur on the walkways, and not many people really care now. There's not that sort of racism or discrimination that we have now, because we have now evolved into a new society because of going through many different things in the world, and of course this horrible sea level rise situation. So in these drawings, I'm mostly showing different parts of what the colony will be about. And on this one, we can see now the transportation system. How will people now reach to different zones around the colony? Well, you would have people in bicycles. People will now use more bicycles. There won't be any vehicles anymore. Here we have parks, and how are people going to be entering these parks? We're going to be taking and carving out parts of the building and putting elements on there so that even children can come and play. Because now in Miami, we don't really have that sort of thing. So I just want to be able to expand this public space and create a better sense of community. And then this is another example of what is now going to happen below the streets, or well, below the quote unquote streets now and the walkways that are connecting each building. What is now happening below the buildings now? We can have aquaculture. That's where the food, that's where we can get the food. We can have scientists that are looking at the new species of fish. We have better species of fish coming in. We have just more fauna in Miami at this point. So now this one would be, it's a rendering and a drawing of how these things are actually going to come together. We would need all these builders and scavengers from the community to put everything together. And then this is the crop lab, which basically calls out for agriculture. Where can we do that? Where can we have ponds? Where can we have the fish coming in? And where can the scientists be so that they explore this new way of life? And that's basically it for me. And that's the colony.
Thank you so much, Maria. It's just wonderful.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone.
Okay, at this point, we're open for questions. I think we've seen several visions. We've seen Roberto's beautiful atlases that give us a sense of what is the flora and fauna for varying conditions. And we've understood the threat of sea level rise as something that doesn't stop at 6 feet. It's just getting going at that point. We've seen some of the implications, some of the history of social justice or lack thereof in Miami, and the aspirations for a more just society, and this idea that inside every crisis is an opportunity. And Maria showed us what we might do, an exercise in imagination that is suggestive. So I think that's a powerful role for architects to take, is to imagine what might be. So are there questions?
So I have questions. We have a little discussion going between me and Elena about whether you can design for water. And salt water and fresh water are very different. Salt water destroys all metals except for 316 stainless steel. And so anytime you have fasteners, the salt water destroys them. Anytime you have steel in concrete, the salt water causes the steel to rust and expand and break apart the concrete, unless you use special hydraulic cements and fresh water to make the concrete up. When Miami was first made, they used beach sand in their concrete because it was right there. And of course, beach sand is full of salt, and all the stainless steel, all the steel reinforcing in the concrete rusted and expanded and broke apart the concrete. And all the buildings in Miami Beach disintegrated. So we don't have any of the old buildings in Miami Beach. They all came apart because of they used coastal sand. And they eventually learned they had to go out to the Everglades and get sand from the freshwater areas and bring them out, which sort of raises the point that building materials get more expensive when you have saltwater flooding also. It's all doable. It's all very expensive. There's a Dutch company that figured out how to make really nice houseboats for saltwater. They're beautiful, they're lovely, and they cost over $1 million a piece for something the size of a shipping container. They're not for the working class. Here's a question for all the DDES students. And that is, are people in your circle, where you live, in your cities, are they discussing sea level rise and how cities change in the face of something we've never seen before? Are we, and Neil, have we turned off the,
we haven't turned it off, but we can if you like.
Let's go ahead and do that so people feel a little free to talk without being recorded for posterity.
Okay.
So Anna Zimbarg, I haven't heard from anything